All right, so one of college football fans' favorite things to do, of course, is complain, right? About a lot of different things. But, like, what's wrong with college football? What do we need to do to fix college football, right? And there's a long list of things that are on people's list when it comes to sort of things that college football gets wrong. But I want to talk today about something that most people agree on. Generally, which is the faking injuries sort of plague that honestly probably has always been around in college football, but obviously over the last 5 or 6 years or so, it's kind of come to the forefront. I think you see a lot more of it now than what we used to see, and I definitely see a lot more complaints about it over the last couple of years than we ever saw before. And I watch a bunch of college football on Saturday just like y'all do, and I see what appear to be players faking injuries in almost every single game just like you do. Now, there are some teams that sort of get shackled with that accusation kind of more than others. Ole Miss, I think, has kind of become a poster child for this kind of thing. Going back really several years under Lane Kiffin, there was a game at Tennessee where they kind of just did it over and over and over and over and over again back when Tennessee was running kind of more of a fast-paced offense than what they run now. And really that's what it's been about the entire time, right? It's basically a way to slow down the opposing offense without having to use a timeout, right? A chance to substitute or whatever it is. Your defense is gassed. You got a team running hurry up. Well, you just fall down, fake an injury. That's going to give you a couple of minutes for your players to rest up while the training staff comes out and pretends to take care of a player that's not injured. So I think that's kind of the obvious angle of the story, is that we watch football games. We see what appears to be an obvious fake of an injury, and we get mad about it. That's kind of something almost everyone can agree on. We don't like it. Where the disagreement or sort of the real problem comes in is, okay, what do you do to address it? What do you do to fix it, right? And there's been ideas float around, everything from penalizing players or teams or coaches to forcing an injured player to sit out for multiple snaps or for an entire series, right? Because basically the way it works now is if you're injured and anyone from the sideline has to come onto the field to tend to you, coaches, trainers, whatever the case, you have to sit out for one play, right? So the idea would be, well, if you come out, you got to sit out for an entire series or an entire quarter or 5 plays or whatever, different ideas batted around that I've heard from fans over the years. My pushback on that has always been, there are some injuries that require you to come out of the game where you could, in theory, be fine to go back into the game on the very next play. And I think the obvious one would be a cramp. Whether you've played sports or not, if you've ever gotten a cramp, it can be completely debilitating. It's serious pain. I mean, I have them sometimes at night in my feet or my legs, and there's nothing you can do. It's completely crippling. Sometimes for a very short period of time, though, right? So in a lot of cases, you see these players fall down, they have a cramp, the trainer comes out, they stretch their leg, whatever it is, they kind of limp off the field. In those cases, it's very possible that the player could be physically able to return to the game on the very next play. Now, how do you prove, and this to me is the biggest problem with the faking injuries deal. How do you prove that a player is faking an injury, and whose job is it to make that decision that a player is so-called faking an injury? And this is what has made this problem so hard to address. When it comes to like identifying a fake injury, there's a famous, I don't remember if it was a congressional hearing or some kind of court case. I don't really remember. Somebody in the comments will maybe remember it more specifically than I do. But there was I think it might have been a court case or a congressional hearing involving Larry Flint from Hustler magazine, if I'm remembering it right. But it was some sort of a pornography hearing in Congress or something. And they asked someone, well, what's your definition of pornography? And the answer basically, and I'm paraphrasing, was, I might not be able to define pornography, but I know it when I see it. Well, that's kind of how I feel about the faking injuries thing. We all kind of know it when we see it. And even if we're not like 100% sure, okay, that player is definitely faking. In a lot of cases, we're 99% sure. There's the examples of you can see a player really literally running off the field and maybe the play clock is down to 2 or 3 and you see the coaches on the sideline just pointing down to the ground, and a player who was fine 5 seconds ago is suddenly incapacitated, laying on the ground and can't move. That just, we see that and we kind of all know what that is, right? That's kind of how I look at it. So that's kind of where we've been for the last few years with the faking injuries thing, right? So the SEC has come out recently, Greg Sankey, and honestly, even though this may potentially solve a problem or attempt to solve a problem, I also think that what's going on here highlights another problem within college football, which maybe I'll talk about at the end. But SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey has put his foot down on the faking injury thing. At least that's what he says. Let me read you some from an article here. SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey sent a memo to league athletic directors and head football coaches outlining the punishment if players continue to fake injuries in games. As plainly as it can be stated, this is a quote, as plainly as it can be stated, stop any and all activity related to faking injuries to create timeouts, Greg Sankey wrote in the memo, a copy of which was obtained by ESPN. He ended the memo by writing, play football and stopped the feigned injury nonsense. Okay, so he's telling teams to stop faking injuries. Well, what if they don't? Well, they outline that too. Here's what's going to happen in the SEC. Punishments laid out in Sankey's memo include the following. For the first offense, a head coach could receive a public reprimand and a $50,000 fine. Now, this is important to note here. In a lot of cases, when fines are issued by conferences, specifically within the SEC, because that's what this is about here. Take the fans storming the field, for example, okay? Who's fined in that scenario? The school. No individual, nobody directly associated with the football team. You can say, well, fans rushing the field doesn't have anything to do with the football field. I get that. But point is, fines generally have been handed down to schools. Think about cheating scandals or recruiting violations or things like that that have occurred over the last 5 to 10 years where even the NCAA will get involved. Who gets fined? The school. In this case, Greg Sankey is going to fine the head coach, an individual, okay? So first offense, a head coach receives a public reprimand and a $50,000 fine. I also like the public reprimand part, and here's why. A lot of things happen or are handled under the table. We don't know. And, you know, when things happen in secret, it creates an aura of mistrust, right? We need to be able to see what's going on. Take, for example, the targeting rule. If you're thrown out of a second half of a game for targeting, you have to sit out the first half of the next game. Well, a lot of conferences, the SEC, the Big Ten, I think all of them, have an appeal process in place where if you're thrown out of the game in the second half, therefore requiring you to sit out the first half of another game, you can appeal the decision. Well, none of that's public knowledge, though. We don't know if a targeting has been appealed. If it is appealed, we don't know the decision. Nothing is told to us as the fans. There's nothing put out. It happens in secret. So in this case, the public reprimand, I think, is almost as important, maybe more important than the $50,000 fine, because according to this anyway, we're going to know as fans, the media members, whoever wants to know, it will be put out in a press release. I'm assuming on some random Monday down the road, hey, we caught such and such team faking an injury in the game this past Saturday. We are fining head coach, whoever, $50,000. We'll know. I like that. For the second offense, another public reprimand and a $100,000 fine. Again, to the head coach, not to the school, not to the athletic department. The head coach directly is fined. And here's the big one. For a third offense, another public reprimand, and the coach will be suspended for his program's next game. So the SEC office is putting all of the burden and onus in this case on the head coach. So, your defensive coordinator is yelling at a defensive lineman to do this and get down because the secondary is gassed or whatever, and then gets caught, head coach gets fined. Happens a third time, head coach gets suspended. Doesn't matter which coach on the sideline is telling the player to fall down. Doesn't matter which player falls down. I find it interesting that nothing is mentioned about the player. Now, I understand that in most cases where we're talking about a faked injury, the player is doing it at the direction of a coach. But honestly, in the age of NIL, I would not at all be opposed to the player that fakes the injury also receiving some sort of a fine. Now, I realize that could create some tension between the player and the coach. The coach tells the player to do something, in this case, fake an injury. The player doesn't do it because he doesn't want to get fined. Okay, he doesn't get fined, but now maybe he's in trouble with the coach. So anyway, so that's the way the SEC has it laid out. If the SEC office, or in this case, Greg Sankey in particular, finds that someone has faked an injury, it's going to be announced publicly. The head coach of the team will be reprimanded publicly by the SEC, and the head coach will be fined. If it happens a second time, same thing. Third time, the SEC office is going to suspend the head coach for one game. Now, that's all great. The immediate question is, who determines that the player was faking the injury? And that's the part I want to get to in a second, but let me just finish this up here. Any staff member found to be involved in signaling or directing a player to feign an injury will face the same measures, including financial penalties and a suspension. So it's not just the head coach. So this, according to this article, the coach, for example, we've all seen videos, right, of a coach on the sideline doing this to a player. Well, that coach is going to get fined and then eventually suspended as well if he's caught a third time. So far, so good. I don't have any problems with this, just to tell you. I've got zero problems with this at all. Sankey told reporters a few weeks ago that he was concerned about the growing accusations of faking injuries. If somebody's injured, we need to take it seriously, but creating the questions, and I mean all across the country, needs to stop. Okay, so if you're a head coach, if a player is caught faking an injury, the head coach in the SEC is going to get reprimanded and fined, as well as whatever assistant, position, or coordinator coach on the sideline was directing the player to fall down. Those two players are going to get publicly reprimanded and fined. If it happens a third time, they're going to get suspended. Okay, so the obvious question, whose job is it to determine whether or not a player was faking an injury? And this is what I like the most about this policy. It's Greg Sankey. That's it. I've talked a long time. A lot of us have. Y'all have called in and talked to me about it. I get comments about it. Other college football people have talked about it. Somebody's got to be in charge. I mean, I know we all hate the NFL, and even if we don't, we pretend to on the internet. But one thing about the NFL, it runs like a well-oiled machine because there is one person in charge. One person, and that's it. And that's the commissioner, Roger Goodell. Now, he creates a lot of enemies because of that, but somebody's got to be in charge. Right now, there's no one in charge of college football. The NCAA is definitely not in charge. You've got sort of four people that are in charge of their own little bubble, the four major conference commissioners, the SEC being Greg Sankey. There's no one running college football as a whole, right? So this is great that Greg Sankey is doing this within the SEC. I'm all for it. I'm all for Greg Sankey having autonomous power here to just go, you know what? I watched the tape. I saw the player appeared to be fine. There was a coach on the sideline doing this, and all of a sudden the player falls down in an obvious attempt to slow down the opposing offense. I'm fine with Greg Sankey having the power to do that. Completely fine with it. Somebody's got to be in charge. And if this is what it takes to sort of rid the game of this fake injury problem, or at least cut a lot of it out, I'm fine with it. I'm completely fine with it. But it highlights, I think, another issue within college football, which is the different sets of rules that apply to each of the conferences. Because of the downfall, the sort of steady decline of the NCAA over the last really 15 to 20 years in the world of college football, all their power and authority, for the most part, has been stripped away. They still every once in a while try to assert themselves through some sort of investigation or whatever, but it's just getting less and less meaningful, the NCAA and as far as it relating to college football. So what you have now is really 4 different leagues operating under their own sets of rules. Not just in this case of the faking injuries thing, but I mentioned earlier about the targeting stuff. That's handled on a conference level, right? So you get thrown out of a game for targeting. You appeal it to who? Your conference. So ask yourself this, and I think I brought this example up before. Let's say we get to conference championship Saturday, okay? And some key player in the SEC championship game gets thrown out for targeting in the second half. And in the Big Ten championship game, some key player gets thrown out in the second half for targeting. Well, by rule, those 2 players have to then sit out the first half of their next game, which could potentially be played against each other in a playoff scenario, right? Well, what if one or both of those conferences go, you know what, that was targeting, but this is a big game, SEC versus Big Ten. Why don't let's just reinstate him for the second half. What if one conference does that and the other one doesn't? What if one conference doesn't even have that process in place to review targeting and potentially overturn it the next day and do away with the suspension? But because each conference is in charge of themselves and there's no one overseeing it all, again, it creates the possibility to play favorites, to bend the rules for certain situations or for certain teams as opposed to others. Now, I think this would obviously be less of an issue during the season, because during the season, with the targeting in particular, the decision that you're making would affect 2 conference teams generally, right? But in the scenario of a conference championship game, you throw a player out in the second half, they got to sit out the first half of the next game. There's nothing to prevent a conference commissioner in the SEC or the Big Ten from going, okay, he got thrown out in the second half, but they got to play such and such in the first round of the playoffs next week, and they really need that guy. Let's just reinstate him. So I'm not arguing for, or the point of that is not to this has nothing to do with targeting. I'm not. What I'm talking about is rules and how they apply differently to different conferences. I'm just using targeting as an example. I know targeting altogether is another sort of hot button issue. Some people want targeting removed. It shouldn't even be a penalty. Some people say stop throwing players out altogether. I'm not even getting into that debate for the purposes of this video. The point I'm making is this is great what the SEC is doing with faking injuries, but no other conferences are doing it. You need to have somebody in charge of all of college football. Everyone needs to be operating under the same set of rules. You can throw referees into this same kind of bucket here, right? Every conference employs their own set of referees. In every conference, some of the rules are different within the different conferences. Well, then you get to a scenario, whether it's playoffs or regular season, where you've got one conference playing a team from another conference, and you could have a set of referees from a third conference. Neither team knows what rules the third set of referees is operating under in that third conference. The referees in the third conference might not know what rules the 2 teams are operating under in their 2 different conferences. It's just a complete mess. So to sort of circle all the way back around and wrap this up, I'm fine with Greg Sankey coming out with this and the punishments for faking injuries. I'm completely fine with him being the sole arbiter of who is or isn't faking injuries, and it being his decision and his decision alone to make, because I think somebody needs to be in charge. My issue is he's only in charge of 16 teams. He can't enforce those rules, nor should he be able to enforce his rules onto the other conferences. We need a football commissioner, someone above conference commissioners. You know, all these conferences have commissioners, the SEC, the Big Ten, they all have them, and they're all in charge of their own conferences individually. And there's no reason why that job has to go away. There are certain things within certain conferences that maybe it should be left up to the conference to regulate on their own. But the overarching issues as they relate to college football as a whole should be the same for all of the major conferences, really even including the Group of 5, as long as we're pretending that the Group of 5 is the same as the Power 4, which I think those 2 should split off. But as long as we're pretending to operate under the umbrella of 134 teams are all the same, even though we know they're not, there needs to be somebody in charge of all of that. And right now there's not. Per usual, this is long-winded and probably twice as long as it needed to be to get the point across, but I hope I was able to get the point across. I'm fine with this. This is about time something happened. I've got no problem with the punishments involved. I've got no problems with the fines involved. I've got no problems with there being one person, in this case, Greg Sankey, who's completely in charge of it. I'm fine with that. Wish we had somebody like that over all of college football. Appreciate you watching. Have a good morning.